In today's lesson, you're going to consider the central poetic image in Seamus Heaney's Personal Helicon. You will explore language in detail. You'll study how precise meaning is crafted in a range of literary devices. You'll notice how adverbials and temporal markers structure time and shift the focus of the poem. You'll reflect on the use of cultural and classical references and what they bring to the text. Then you'll deconstruct and understand the nature of narrative recounting and explore the creation of poetic voice and viewpoint. Before we start, look at these three images from children's literature. You have Alice in Wonderland, Harry Potter and Frodo Baggins. In each of the texts you can see a device is used to transport the central character and therefore the narrator into a different world. In Alice, she steps through a looking glass, a mirror. She goes beyond her reflection to see what's the other side of the world. It transforms her. In Harry Potter, the pensive is used to store thoughts, but it is like a pool, a reflecting pool, that you can look back into those thoughts and reflect on who you are, what you are, where you've come from. And in The Lord of the Rings, Frodo Baggins is asked to look into the mirror of Galadriel. It is almost a visionary pool to see what might be, what could be, what is. In each of the texts, the reflecting pools are held up to consider that situation. The persona is asked to confront who they are, what they might be. If you look at an ordinary well, there's a lot of mystery associated with it because quite often they are considered to have healing properties because the water was clean. They are found in rural communities as the centre of the community. And when you look into them, you see yourself. You see yourself reflected, or a silhouette of yourself. They seem strange, mysterious, and there are superstitions attached to them. Often we will throw money in a well for good luck, or we will make a wish. If you look in this picture, you can see that the well is almost like a tunnel rather than a well. It looks as though you're walking through it, and therefore wells become metaphors for gateways, as if there is something strange in the depths, strange and unworldly, mysterious.
Personal Helicon, for Michael Longley. As a child, they could not keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I loved the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus and dank moss. One in a brickyard with a rotted board top. I savoured the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope, so deep you saw no reflection in it. A shallow one under a dry stone ditch, fructified like any aquarium. When you dragged out long roots from the soft mulch, a white face hovered over the bottom. Others had echoes, gave back your own call with a clean new music in it. And one was scaresome, for there, out of ferns and tall foxgloves, a rat slapped across my reflection.
As a child, Seamus Heaney often would play around wells. He says at the beginning, they could not keep me from wells. He has a fascination with them. They are a delight, and they are somewhere where he can go and see himself reflected in there and play, a kid with water. If you look in the text, there are references to him dragging out long roots, playing in the soft mulch, and there's at the bottom here is his white face hovering. The other thing is that there's a terror about it, because at the depths of that there is also something unpleasant lurking, and here it is a rat. In this well we see the soft fronds of the ferns creating a very mysterious cave-like dwelling, and it is in that cave-like dwelling that he is shocked by the rat, the scaresome thing he calls it, It slaps across his reflection as if it's actually on his face. A terrifying thing for a small child. If you look at the verbs in the text, the first 4 stanzas place all of the events in the past, where there are a number of wells that Heaney recalls playing at or with when he was young. As a child, he says, they could not keep me from wells. I loved the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed. One in a brickyard with rotted board top. I savoured the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope, so deep you saw no reflection in it. In these verbs, in these recollections of his memory, he constructs himself as a child, not just as a temporal marker, but as a poetic voice, recalling those moments. He recounts the sounds. He evokes the events of the bucket dropping and the crash when it hits. The sounds are dramatic and visceral. He moves from the past, recalling the shallow one under a dry stone ditch. It's fructified like aquarium. The fructification is a fruitfulness. Something mysterious is growing in that darkness. And out from it he drags long roots. It is a fecund, fertile place. A place full of that water that they depend on, the clean water. Others had echoes. So it's not just the sounds that he creates, but the mysterious echoing of it, the recreation of sound as if there is something living in it. And that creates mystery and fear. There's something scaresome there, he says. That strange word, a bit like a childish word. And there in the ferns, mysterious, the rat. It slaps across his reflection as if it's actually on him, the terrible creature in that deep darkness. All of those things are from his past. He weaves them together, the sounds, the actions, the memories. At the end there is a turn with now. Now to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare big narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. Big-eyed Narcissus, the classical reference to that ancient myth of the young man, attractive, who looks into the mirror of water, reflecting his own image back. And he is falling in love with himself, peering into that mirror. There is the warning, the narcissism of poets who see themselves in their work, only themselves. He says at the end, I rhyme to see myself. His poetry is like staring into the Personal Helicon of ancient Greece, seeing himself, writing about himself, and there's a sense of guilt in that as well. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. But just as the something comes out of the dark, the mystery of the helicon, the mystery of the well, the poetry is what reflects Seamus Heaney back. He sets the darkness echoing when he writes. If you look at each stanza separately, we can begin to see how the prosody of the verse constructs the sense, the mood, and evokes the moment. As a child, they could not keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I loved the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus, and dank moss. You have a contrast between some long vowels at the start and then the sudden short vowels. The memory that drops into his mind. The memory of what was dropped in the well. They could not keep me from wells. A child, the long vowels slow those evocative memories down. But then the old pumps, buckets, windlasses are sudden, exciting. The harsh plosives and the sibilants on pumps, buckets, and then windlasses. I loved the dark drop. Again, more slow, longer vowels. Loved, dark, and the sudden drop. And again, you've got alliteration of that D with the harsher sounds, and then the plosives of K and P. The trapped sky, the smells. Interestingly, the fricative on as, wells, smells, brackets all of these sounds with a very comforting sound. And then you get the waterweed, the fungus, and the dank moss. Notice how those short O's drop, and the cadence of that creates a sense of a final image. The image that echoes through his mind. In this stanza, another well in a brickyard with a rotted board top. I savoured the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope, so deep you saw no reflection in it. Here you've got a sense of danger. The board top is rotted as if he could fall through at any moment. And he savours the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope. The onomatopoeic crash breaks through there, exciting, but it's a rich crash. It might be destructive, but it is a rich memory, valuable, cherished, and it's savoured now. The bucket plummeted down. The assonance of the short U, and then the long, slow down at the end of the rope. Those longer vowels are a cherishing, are a savouring of that moment, a recollection of it. And it is so deep, you saw no reflection in it. That well is dangerous. That well, he cannot see himself. All of that is there in the sounds, in the slow rhythm. In this well, there is a mystery of darkness, but also of fertility, a shallow one under a dry stone ditch. The dry stone ditch suggests it's ancient, but it is fructified like any aquarium. The word fructified suggests it's fertile, fruitful, and there are things growing there. So although wells might be dark and deep and mysterious and terrifying, they also bring forth life. And when you dragged out long roots from the soft mulch, a white face hovered over the bottom. That white face may be his reflection, but it is also a mysterious otherworldly face. Something on the other side, at the depth. It is also a ghostly face, as if it's not really quite his own, as if there's a split personality, just as the poet is writing about himself as an adult, looking back at the child, the ghostly face from his childhood reflected through the verse. In this stanza, he looks at the sounds of the well. We've had the crash and the excitement earlier, and now you've got echoes. References to Narcissus and Echo are tragic classical allusions. Here, Echo gave you back your call with a clean new music in it. And ironically, the poet is constructing his own voice with a clean new music, the music of the poem. The poem, the Personal Helicon poem, isn't just a reflection, it is the reflection. It is the music of his youth, now echoing through these words. One was scaresome, for there, out of the ferns and tall foxgloves, a rat slapped across my reflection. Notice how the softer sounds at the beginning are beautiful and have this sense of musicality. But now we have the ferns and a tall foxgloves with a rat that slapped. The assonance of the short A and those harsh plosives destroy that melody, destroy that moment with the shock of this disgusting creature. The final stanza, as I said, is the turn, and we get that with the temporal marker now. We shift to the present. We shift to the adult world. We shift to the poet, bringing all of these ideas into a finely crafted text. Now, to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare big-eyed Narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. There's a sense that Heaney is looking at his text and sees it as unworthy. What he's doing is not really an adult behaviour, as if there's a childishness about it. To pry into roots recalls the childhood playing with weeds and dabbling in the wells, but here he is literally prying into his roots. The metaphor for writing poetry is to pry. At the beginning of this collection of poetry, he has written digging. There the poet was digging with a pen metaphorically. And in this text, he is prying into the roots of his childhood, recalling across the collection of poetry all of the things he's done as a child that made him who he is. He is fingering slime, just as he was recalling the frog spawn, recalling the fungus growing on the blackberries. The slime is a very visceral thing, and from it he stares big-eyed Narcissus into some spring. He's staring at himself, he's staring at his memories, his evocative experience of a poet. And there's a sense of guilt in doing that, as if it's not worthy. And yet there is an adult dignity in recalling, reconstructing his path. The last line is the last line of his first collection. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. He writes, he is a poet, to define himself, to identify himself, and to find his voice, to create his voice from all that he is and all that he was. And he wants to do that, to set the darkness echoing, as if speaking breaks the darkness, like setting some light in place. He creates who he is and what he is. And interestingly, the darkness of that last line appears in the title of his next collection, A Door into the Dark. The poem has a dedication to Michael Longley, a fellow poet and a member of the Belfast group, whom we see in the photograph there on the left, and Heaney on the right, and then in the larger photograph as he's older. So, unlike most of his poems, this one is dedicated to another fellow poet. In these pictures and notes you can see the windlass, the winching gear for winding your full bucket of water up. But imagine it throwing down the heavy weight, the rope, as it crashes down to the bottom. And to fructify is to make something fruitful or productive. So that sense of fertility around the well, the growth, the cleanliness, and mysterious, and the healing properties of fresh water. Here we see some foxgloves, and they're noted for growing in shade, and so they're one of the few beautiful plants that grow wild around shady areas and stand proud. Mount Helicon is a classical reference to the ancient hill in Greece where Apollo and the Muses met, and at Mount Helicon they would look into pools and divine the future, and the prophets would see into those things. And so by writing the Personal Helicon, this poem is his reflection pool, his store of memories, where he sees who and what he is, and from which he draws his sense of identity. Just as he refers to Narcissus, the name Narcissus has been given to some kinds of daffodils that often grow at the edges of pools, and as they wilt, they lean over and you see their reflections like Narcissus, beautiful, fine, pleasant. And so in psychological terms, we have the concepts of narcissism and being narcissistic. And that is what Heaney feels as he writes poetry. There's a sense of guilt about whether he should be writing. If you remember at the beginning of the collection in Digging, he knows he cannot do what previous generations have done, and that he will be a poet, and that he will dig with his pen. And by the end of the collection, he's reflecting on who he is and what he is in his own personal helicon. Narcissistic, self-centered, unable to identify himself from the external Heaney and the internal Heaney, and the Heaney he puts on paper. Now to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare big-eyed Narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. And that is the end of his first collection of poetry, the end of that poem. But it is what he's doing when he writes any poem, to pry into his roots, to finger the slime of his existence, to feel it, to know it, to recall it, and to stare out into space as himself, seeing as himself, seeing himself, understanding who he is. And he rhymes to know all of that and to celebrate it, to set the darkness echoing with his voice and with the voice of his people, the culture that he grew up in and celebrates in verse.